Welcome to the Interstellar Age. Season 3, Parabellum. Episode 6, What Watches the Watchers? 2350 to 2374. In May 2351, Rance Wolf, the Starbird, died. At 122, his life had spanned a momentous era of human affairs, from the early days of colonial development through the first interstellar wars to the formation of a grand alliance between humans and aliens against machine threats. In each of these great movements, he had played an important role, developing trade between the free worlds, defeating the first Chiron invasions, cementing the Coalition and then the Republic, helping defeat the corporate worlds and the Ciphers, and securing an alliance between the free worlds and the Terran Union. In the process, he had set the doctrinal tone for human militaries in space for over a century. Arguably, he was the only genuine military genius humanity produced from the end of the Third World War to the 25th century. His passing was marked by effusive eulogies throughout the free worlds, and a massive public funeral on freedom, which drew mourners and dignitaries from across human and virgonid space. Terran Parliament praised his military exploits, and voted posthumously to make him an honorary citizen of the Union, in recognition of his role in securing victory during the corporate world's war. Praise from the UCC was much more measured. The Council's official statement on his death focused on his efforts to make peace between the human powers later in life, rather than his military endeavors, many of which were openly decried as war crimes by the more activist councilors in their dissents. His death marked a major turning point in human affairs, not least because it coincided with the most shattering discovery in over half a century. The first close-up reconnaissance missions of the Cipher-occupied systems of Bias, Embra, and Rannoch returned with their data just 2 months before Wolf's death. As a former president of the Free World's Republic and its greatest military leader, Wolf was briefed on the mission's findings, even as his health was failing. It was on these that he made his final public pronouncement. Laconic as ever, it would become his best-known quotation after his famous Latin paraphrase on the formation of the Coalition in 2279. Si vis astra parabellum, he had said then. Now, he added, quid custodit ipsos custodes? What watches the watchers? The uncanny simplicity of the phrase captured the sense of unease, even dread, which the reconnaissance mission's findings produced. The Cipher presence varied significantly from one system to the next. On Rannoch, a highly urbanized industrial world home to a primatoid species, the machine's presence appeared minimal, akin to their semi-covert harassment and observation in the Sol system prior to first contact. On Bias, a pastoral civilization of small mammalianoid beings seemed to be subject to much more direct control. In the preliminary data, Cipher platforms were seen openly and frequently flying over Biasian villages, and landing and interacting with the natives. Embra, midway in development between Bias and Rannoch, showed a similar pattern. In each case, more direct and longer-term observations would be necessary to determine what the precise nature of the Cipher occupation was, how long they had been there, and what they might be trying to achieve. But how, or whether, that data should be collected was a matter of furious debate within the Alliance. The discovery of Cipher-occupied planets less than 1,000 light-years from human space prompted the more bellicose members to call for an immediate offensive, both to eliminate the Cipher threat and to liberate the subject species. More hopeful voices, most of them in the UCC, argued instead for making contact with the Ciphers, in the hopes that old wounds could be healed, or that these Ciphers might have different goals than the ones previously encountered. This was not simply based on wishful thinking. Clearly, these machines had played no role in the war. If they had, the Alliance would almost certainly have been defeated. Indeed, since no Cipher platforms had been detected in Allied space since the end of the war, it was entirely possible that these Ciphers did not know humanity or the Virgonids existed at all. A theory was put forward that the machine world might have been an isolated outpost, possibly of a splinter faction, or whatever the equivalent for a machine civilization might be. If so, peaceful relations with these machines might well be possible. Even so, making contact, whether military or diplomatic, remained a risk. A middle course, championed by the Virgonids, sought to take advantage of the fact that the reconnaissance missions had not been detected by the Ciphers. That gave the Alliance the opportunity to continue observing the occupied systems from a distance, gathering more information that might inform one or the other direct option in the future. Ultimately, this middle path won out. Allied Joint Command, AJC, ordered that no further close-in missions were to be sent to these systems, which were placed strictly off-limits to civilian traffic by the Allied governments. Instead, stealthed automated observation platforms were set up in deep space a few light weeks from each system, far enough away that accidental detection would be nearly impossible, close enough to provide relatively current intelligence. Over the next few years, these platforms collected some disturbing data on the nature of the Cipher occupation. As the preliminary findings had suggested, a different playbook seemed to be in operation on each of the populated worlds. On outwardly peaceful Bias, Cipher platforms were observed exhibiting highly variant behavior patterns between different clan-like groupings. Certain Biasian groups seemed to be favored by the machines. Cipher platforms were observed aiding in the growth and harvesting of crops, building structures, and other similar activities. These Biasians apparently worshipped the machines, praying to them and erecting monuments in their honor. Other Biasian groupings were terrorized with abductions, killings, burning, and evidently prayed to the machines only for the terror to stop. These groups often came into conflict with one another, while the machines stood off and watched, doing nothing to halt the internecine slaughter. Embra showed a similar pattern, with various nations pitted against one another as if responding to the urging of their gods. There was also evidence of some form of genetic manipulation, the rapid evolution of traits between different racial subgroups, which could not be accounted for naturally. Yet it was on Rannak where the most disturbing findings, from the human perspective, emerged. On the highly developed world, the Ciphers appeared to be influencing the Ranakeen primarily through clandestine means. Fleeting sightings were punctuated by occasional abductions, but unlike on Bias and Embra, the abductee would always be returned after a time. While long-distance observation could not determine what was actually being done to these Ranakeen aboard Cipher ships, the returning abductees often told similar stories about medical experiments and psychedelic experiences. Many abductees reported conversing with Ranakeen-like simulacra, who would deliver cryptic messages before returning them home. This pattern was eerily reminiscent of events widely reported on Earth throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, when humans had been at a similar level of development to the Ranakeen. Even more disturbing were another pair of discoveries. In the first, evidence emerged that the Ciphers were covertly inserting themselves into Ranakeen communications and mass media. Whether they were simply reading the Ranakeen's mail, so to speak, or taking a more active role in subtly shaping global events could not be determined. In either case, it raised the possibility that the machines had been doing the same thing on Earth for over a century. In the second, Cipher platforms were tracked emerging from and returning to Ranak's oceans after aerial and suborbital flights. Extrapolating data over a number of months, Allied intelligence was able to locate a Cipher facility of some kind on the Ranakeen ocean floor, which appeared to serve as a base for the aerospace craft. Given observations of the machine world, it was speculated that this facility might well be producing the craft, rather than simply housing and refueling them. The discovery kicked off a frantic search for similar underwater bases on Earth, Virgon, and the colonies. While none were discovered, numerous credible mid-21st century reports of Cipher-like craft emerging from or descending into Earth's oceans were pulled from archives. This meant that the possibility such bases had once existed could not be discounted. It may simply have been that the Ciphers took advantage of their advanced materials science to deconstitute them after withdrawing from human space in the early 22nd century. These disturbing findings led to a large-scale rearmament program throughout the Allied powers, even in the UCC, though to a lesser degree and with greater public resistance. As part of this military expansion program, the Free World's Navy explored a number of new technologies. Many of these were merely iterative or proved to be dead ends, but one was revolutionary. During the Battle of the Machine World, the Ciphers had made use of a devastating particle beam weapon, whose mechanism at the time had been poorly understood. Studies of destroyed platforms and the machine world itself after the war had provided some answers, but also led to more questions. The Cipher weapon was dubbed the Ultra-Relativistic Electron Beam, or UREB. UREBs funnel the energy output from a reactor directly into a converter generating high-energy neutralized electrons. This electron stream is then funneled into a linear accelerator, which accelerates the stream near to the speed of light in a coherent beam. The high velocity of the beam increases the effective range of the weapon, since ultra-relativistic effects delay dispersion from the external reference frame of the target. UREBs can inflict severe kinetic and thermal damage on targets at long range, as well as unleashing significant quantities of lethal braking radiation. The range and power of the UREB is in theory limited by the fact that a cyclotron accelerator cannot be used in conjunction with the LINAC. Bending a high-energy electron beam at relativistic velocities also unleashes significant braking radiation, creating potentially lethal effects for crews and delicate systems aboard the firing vessel. However, most Cipher platforms employing the weapon were too short to employ an effective LINAC. Instead, they used small but highly efficient cyclotron accelerators. The Cipher platforms, having no crews and powerful internal shielding, were apparently able to absorb the radiation this released. Until now, Allied engineers had been unable to reproduce a working copy of the weapon that did not suffer from unfeasible energy requirements or prohibitive radiation production. In 2355, Freeworlder engineers made a breakthrough, devising a new form of LINAC paired with a new, higher-efficiency power transfer system. Together, these could produce the key relativistic effects that made the weapon function. Even this prototype and its production model descendants had an enormous power draw and a disturbing tendency to fail and produce lethal radiation bursts. This tendency increased when it was operated simultaneously with other high-powered systems, such as weapons, engines, or stealth. As a result, despite the hopes of its designers, the UREB could not reliably be employed as a primary weapon throughout the Free World's Navy. But it could still be a game-changer in space combat, if it could be paired with other systems. The Free World's Navy elected to draft a new long-range firepower cruiser, the Longbow class, armed exclusively with the UREB. New space combat doctrines placed these longbows in a central role, supported by traditionally armed ships. This was in contrast with previous post-war Allied fleet doctrines centered on drone carriers. The Free World Navy's Frontier Fleet was the first to receive the longbows. The plan was to roll them out throughout the FWN as rapidly as possible, since it was expected that a large-scale war with the Ciphers might break out at any time within the next 5 years. The other allies were keenly interested in the UREB as well, though there was a significant degree of skepticism among military traditionalists, at least until the weapon could be tested in battle. Nonetheless, given the expectation of war with the Ciphers, AJC requested that the free worlds share the new technology with the other allies. Some hawks in Congress argued that the weapon should be kept proprietary, but given that the TIU had shared the Mark IV star drive with them, the majority decided that they had little choice but to share the UREB with the Terrans and Virgonids in return. However, They would not approve sharing it with the UCC. The Council's criticisms of free-worlder militarism had only increased through the years, as had free-worlder criticisms of citizen freeloading, both growing more intense even as military action became less frequent. Congress would only commit to share UREB technology with the UCC in the event of war with the Ciphers, should it prove necessary. While UCC military leaders decried the decision, the response from the citizen public was largely a shrug. Despite Allied fears, year after year went by, and the war did not come. The Ciphers still, apparently, had no idea their planets were being observed. Yet given the omnipresent threat, the AJC felt a military drawdown was inadvisable. With their enlarged fleets gathering dust and their new weapons going untested, the Hawks began to grow restless. Meanwhile, Chiron raids had been growing more audacious over the past decade. Chiron's stealth capabilities had become more sophisticated, allowing them to slip past FWN defenses in less developed systems. While these raids were invariably destroyed or driven off, they often inflicted damage and casualties before being defeated. There was growing concern that, in the event of a new war with the Ciphers, the Chirons might be able to take advantage of the distraction to launch even more devastating invasions. Thus, in 2358, the President and the Republic's military chiefs made a secret decision to end the Chiron threat on a more permanent basis, before the Ciphers attacked. After building up strength under the guise of an exercise, the FWN launched an invasion of 4 Chiron systems, those from which the majority of raids on the free worlds had originated. Despite their advances in stealth tech, the space forces of the disunited Chiron clans were easily obliterated by the FWN, with the new UREB weapons proving their worth. This was not the first time the free worlders had invaded Chiron space. The difference was that this time, instead of striking Chiron military targets and withdrawing, the Navy stayed. Days later, transports arrived in orbit of each of the worlds, and began debarking ground troops. On the surface, the Chirons were much more dangerous than in space, and they fought ferociously. The badly outnumbered Free World's ground forces contingents made liberal use of orbital fire support and superior reconnaissance to gain the upper hand, gradually expanding their bridgeheads and inflicting massive casualties on the Chirons, devastating the landscape in the process. Not all of the destruction so inflicted fell on Chiron warriors. Each of the 4 colony worlds, out of the dozens believed to be inhabited by the Chirons, appeared to serve a primarily military purpose. Unlike their larger inhabited conquests, the clans had settled these systems within the last 200 years. Their locations near the borders with the free worlds made them ideal staging grounds for attacks against the Republic, as well as denying potentially habitable worlds to human colonization. Yet despite their military nature, each world had a population in the millions. Most of these were alien slaves or Chiron worker species, shipped to these planets in large numbers as a workforce supporting the warrior population, and as sentient shields, complicating the free world's efforts to target purely military assets. This strategy proved highly effective. The distinction between military and civilian was difficult for the FWGF to make. Many Chiron worker castes, and even some slaves, were perfectly willing to engage in direct combat with Free World's forces. Chiron warriors nearly always surrounded their bases with civilian structures, and often dragged unfortunate slaves into combat with their frontline units. As a result, even though the Free World's navy did not use UREBs or nuclear weapons in a ground attack role, non-combatant casualties soared on each of the worlds as the battles dragged on. The invasion and the Republic's tactics prompted immediate denunciations from both the UCC and the TIU. AJC had only been given a day's notice before the invasion began, an effort by the free worlds to maintain operational security with severe diplomatic consequences. The Terrans and Virgonid's criticism was fairly measured, acknowledging the threat posed by the Chirons and the free world's right to self-defense, but urging restraint lest the conflict expand. The UCC's denunciations, on the other hand, were vociferous and accompanied by a massive outcry from the general public. A growing movement on the councils threatened to withdraw from the alliance if the invasion was not stopped. While the ruling parties managed to hold back this movement for the time being, the crisis would only deepen, particularly as the Republic showed no indication it intended to back down in the face of moral pressure. Still, as the invasions dragged on, with no indications the Chirans would surrender either, the military wisdom of continuing the campaign was called into question. The original invasion plan called for subduing the Chiran core worlds once these outposts were dealt with. But the massive investment of troops and material required to pacify these border worlds would doubtless be expanded manyfold in the Chiran core. The free worlds would have to resort to ever greater firepower to achieve victory, leading to disastrous diplomatic consequences given the already fraying relationship with the Alliance. Arguments that the broader invasion could not succeed received support when several of the terminally fractious Chiran clans united in an attempt to throw the Free World's military out of the border systems. Their counterattack failed, but even the attempt showed that further invasions would provoke further unification, drastically increasing the risk of catastrophic escalation. At the same time, all but the most inveterate anti-Chiran officers and politicians in the Republic recognized that the Ciphers represented a much greater existential threat. A full-scale commitment to invading and pacifying the major Chiran worlds would only open the Republic up to a much more dangerous foe. Therefore, in early 2360, the President announced that the mission was accomplished. The four worlds had been largely pacified, with all but a handful of Chiran warrior holdouts killed and no more meaningful resistance from the civilian population. Repatriating Chiran workers to their own clans proved impossible, and sending the slave populations back to their masters was unthinkable. The Free World's armed forces would thus have to maintain occupation forces in all four systems, quelling dissent and fending off Chiran reprisal raids, while various civilian organizations aided the locals in rebuilding and establishing their own governments. Since all the largest and deadliest Chiran raids against the Free Worlds had been launched from these four systems, this was seen as a victory in the ongoing conflict. And unofficially, it was hoped that Chiran anger at the loss of these worlds, and the shorter range of Chiran star drives, would focus any future raids or invasions against them, rather than the Free Worlds themselves. This assumption would prove largely correct, at least in the near term. But over time, the continued need to combat insurgency and unrest on the occupied worlds, as well as Chiran raids, made them an ever-deepening resource sink. Nevertheless, for the time being, this arrangement placated the Terrans and Virgonids, whose main concern was preventing a general war and preserving strength to meet the Cipher threat. The UCC would continue to lobby for the withdrawal of all Republic occupation forces from Chiran space, but these tensions reduced to a simmer, and the Alliance had survived yet another crisis. Meanwhile, Allied explorers pushed the boundaries ever further, searching for new colonial opportunities, new civilizations, and more signs of the Ciphers. In 2374, a sanctioned TIU science expedition arrived in the Sukhat system. The inhabited world had been under long-range observation for years, and appeared to host a fairly advanced, urbanized civilization, similar to mid-21st century Earth. No sign of Cipher presence had been detected, and so a close-in mission was authorized. Its goal was similar to that of the Virgonids in the 20th century: observe the civilization more closely and determine the feasibility of eventual contact. The expedition ships employed stealth technology, taking all precautions to ensure the locals would not detect them. After arriving, the team was meant to send a communications drone with an update on the situation. But the drone never arrived. Instead, one of the expedition ships limped back into the nearest port weeks later, heavily damaged. The other two ships, the shaken crew said, had been captured by the Ciphers.